The crystal spires of the Zephyrian capital gleamed like frozen lightning against the purple sky. Inside the Grand Palace's negotiation chamber, tension crackled through the air like static electricity. Ambassador Marcus Chen sat perfectly still, at the obsidian conference table, his weathered hands folded, watching the alien delegation with calm, dark eyes. Princess Veltara of the Zephyrian Empire swept into the chamber like a living storm. Her iridescent skin shifted from deep blue to angry crimson as her forearms gestured dramatically. Behind her flowed a cape made of what looked like liquid starlight, and her elongated skull bore the traditional crown of her house, a circlet of what humans had learned were compressed neutron fragments. "So," she hissed, her voice carrying the musical quality all Zephyrians possessed, "the Terran Federation sends us this creature to discuss the fate of 17 star systems." Marcus didn't flinch. At 53, he had negotiated trade agreements with beings that could digest metal, peace treaties with hive minds that spoke in chemical signals, territorial disputes with energy beings that existed partially outside normal spacetime. A young alien royal having a tantrum barely registered on a scale of diplomatic challenges. "Your Highness," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the slight Texas accent he'd never quite shaken. "I'm here as requested by your father, Emperor Zaxthal, to discuss the terms of my father." Princess Veltara's laugh was like breaking glass. "My father grows weak in his old age. Soon, very soon, I will rule this empire. And when I do, primitive species like yours will know their place." She leaned across the table, her large, multifaceted eyes glittering with malice. "Look at you, soft pink flesh. Only 2 arms. No natural armor, no energy projection capabilities, no telepathic abilities. Your entire species lives for barely a century. You're little more than mayflies pretending to be eagles." The other Zephyrian officials shifted uncomfortably. Even in their aristocratic society, openly insulting a diplomatic guest was considered poor form, but Princess Veltara was known for her passionate nature. Marcus absorbed every word without reaction. He'd heard worse. Much worse. The crystalline hegemony had once called humans ambulatory meat sacks with delusions of grandeur. The Voidwalkers preferred temporary chemical arrangements with excessive noise output, but something in the young princess's tone, the casual cruelty mixed with absolute certainty, told him this wasn't just diplomatic posturing. This was genuine contempt. "Your species," she continued, warming to her subject, "achieved faster than light travel barely 200 years ago. We've had it for over 10,000. You have one homeworld. We control 400 star systems. We live in metal cans floating through space. We reshape entire planets to our will." She stood to her full height, nearly 8 feet tall, all 4 arms spread wide in a gesture of dominance. "What could you possibly offer us that we would want? What could you possibly threaten us with that we would fear?" The chamber fell silent, except for the soft hum of the palace's quantum processors. Marcus looked around the table at the other Zephyrian officials. Some seemed embarrassed by their princess's behavior. Others watched with the careful attention of political predators sensing opportunity. Finally, Marcus spoke. His voice was soft, almost gentle. "Nothing at all, Your Highness." The simplicity of his response seemed to catch her off guard. She had clearly expected anger, defensiveness, perhaps some attempt to list humanity's achievements or threaten economic sanctions. Instead, Marcus Chen stood up from his chair with the unhurried movements of a man who had made a decision. He gathered his tablet and stylus, sliding them into his simple leather briefcase that had traveled with him to over 40 worlds and through negotiations that had shaped the political landscape of 3 spiral arms. "Where are you going?" Prince Veltara demanded, her skin shifting to a confused shade of yellow-green. Marcus looked at her one more time, not with anger, not with hurt pride, but with something far more unsettling, a kind of quiet assessment, as if he was looking at her and seeing exactly what she was and finding it insufficient. "Home," he said simply, and then he did something that no diplomat, no trade representative, no military officer, no servant, and certainly no one of lower species had ever done in the presence of Zephyrian royalty. He turned his back on her and walked away. The massive doors of the negotiation chamber whispered shut behind him with a soft, final sound that somehow felt louder than any explosion. In the silence that followed, Princess Veltara stared at the closed doors with a mixture of shock and rage that slowly began to curdle into something else entirely. Uncertainty, Chapter 2. The silence, the human embassy ship diplomatic immunity hung in the void above Zephyr. Prime like a sleeping giant, unlike the flowing organic curves of Zephyrian vessels or the crystalline fractals of most alien architectures. The human ship was all clean lines and purposeful angles. It looked exactly like what it was, a tool built by a species that had learned to survive in the harshest corners of the galaxy through simple, reliable engineering. Ambassador Marcus Chen sat in his private office, watching through the viewport. As the purple and gold swirls of Zephyr Prime rotated slowly beneath them, his expression was calm, almost meditative. He'd dismissed his staff for the evening and was enjoying the rare luxury of complete silence. A soft chime indicated an incoming communication. Marcus glanced at his screen and saw the seal of the Zephyrian Imperial Palace. He let it chime 3 more times before accepting the call. Chief Minister Zelkath appeared on the holographic display. His ancient features creased with what humans had learned to recognize as diplomatic anxiety. The old Zephyrian had been managing imperial foreign policy for over 3 centuries, and his reputation for smooth crisis management was legendary. Ambassador Chen Zoketh began, his voice carrying the formal harmonics of High Court Zephyrian. "I trust you are well this evening." "Quite well, thank you, Minister." Marcus's tone was polite but neutral. "How may I help you?" "I'm calling to ... clarify ... certain events that occurred during today's session. Princess Veltara is young, you understand, passionate. Sometimes her enthusiasm for the glory of the Empire leads her to express herself in ways that might be misinterpreted." Marcus said nothing. The silence stretched between them, growing heavier with each passing second. Zalkath's skin shifted to a nervous pale blue. "The Emperor wishes to reschedule tomorrow's negotiations, perhaps with a different configuration of attendees, more senior voices to guide the discussion." "I'm afraid that won't be possible, Minister." "Oh." Zalkath's eye stalks twisted slightly, a sign of confusion. "Is there a scheduling conflict?" "I'm certain we can accommodate. There are no further negotiations to schedule," Marcus said quietly. "I'm returning to Earth tomorrow morning." The silence that followed was profound. In the background, Marcus could hear the soft sounds of the Imperial Palace, the whisper of servo mechanisms, the distant chime of ceremonial bells, the barely audible hum of a civilization that had never known defeat. "Ambassador Zelkath," finally said, his voice now carrying urgent harmonics, "surely there's been some misunderstanding. The trade routes through the Kepler Nebula alone are worth trillions of credits annually. Technological exchanges we've proposed could advance both our civilizations by centuries. These negotiations represent the potential for a partnership that could reshape this entire galactic sector." Marcus nodded slowly. "Yes, they do." "Then surely, Minister," Marcus interrupted gently, "in my experience, successful partnerships require mutual respect. Without that foundation, all the trade routes and technological exchanges in the galaxy are meaningless." Zalkath's image flickered slightly as he leaned forward. "The princess meant no true disrespect, Ambassador. She is proud of her heritage. Surely you can understand that." "Of course I can," Marcus replied. "Pride in one's people is natural and healthy. But there's a difference between pride in what you are and contempt for what others are." The old minister's shoulders sagged slightly. What would it take to repair this situation? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the stars. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that Zalkath had not heard before. "Minister, I've been doing this job for 27 years. I've sat across negotiation tables from beings that could snuff out our sun with a thought. I've broken bread with species so ancient they remember when this galaxy was young. Made peace between civilizations separated by millions of light years and billions of years of evolution." He turned back to face the holographic display. "But I have never, not once, continued a negotiation with someone who made it clear they viewed my entire species as inherently inferior. Not because I'm too proud, but because such negotiations are doomed to fail. You cannot build lasting agreements on a foundation of contempt. Zalcath was quiet for several long moments. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of genuine curiosity. What will you tell your superiors? How will you explain the failure of these negotiations? Marcus smiled, a small, tired expression that somehow contained depths of experience. I'll tell them the truth, that the Zephyrian Empire isn't ready for the kind of partnership we were hoping to build, and that perhaps in time that might change. And if it doesn't, what then? Marcus's expression grew thoughtful. Then we'll do what we've always done, Minister. We'll find another way forward. The communication ended, leaving Marcus alone with the stars and the profound silence of space. Outside his viewport, Zephyr Prime continued its ancient rotation. It's beautiful and distant, while somewhere in its crystal palaces, a young princess was learning that the universe was far more complex than she had imagined. Chapter 3. The consequences 3 weeks later. Princess Veltara stood on the observation deck of the Imperial Dreadnought Pride of Zephyr, watching the human colony ship New Horizons lumber through space toward the Kepler Junction. The massive vessel was ugly by Zephyrian standards, all function over form. The radiation shielding that made it look like a flying mountain, but it carried something that had begun to trouble her sleep. 40,000 human colonists bound for a new world. Your Highness, Captain Mordith reported, his voice carrying the crisp efficiency of a career military officer. The human vessel has reached the junction. They're beginning their approach to the hyperspace entry point. Veltara said nothing. She'd been tracking human movements through Zephyrian space ever since that infuriating Ambassador Chen had walked away from her. What she'd discovered had begun to gnaw at her mind like a persistent parasite. In the 3 weeks since the failed negotiations, 17 separate human trade convoys had rerouted around Zephyrian space entirely. 2 major terraforming corporations had quietly withdrawn bids for Zephyrian atmospheric conversion projects. The Terran Federation had stopped responding to communications from the Imperial Palace entirely. Most troubling of all, the humans had begun making new friends. Captain, she said finally, show me the tactical display. The holographic projector in the center of the observation deck flickered to life, showing the Kepler Junction and surrounding space. The human colony ship appeared as a blue dot, moving steadily toward the hyperspace entry point. But it wasn't alone. 3 crystalline hegemony escort vessels, Captain Mordith reported, to Void Walker scout ships, and ... He paused, his skin shifting to an uncomfortable orange, 1 Apex Confederation battlecruiser. Princess Veltara felt something cold settle in her stomach. The Apex Confederation was older than the Zephyrian Empire by several millennia. They were also notoriously selective about who they chose to associate with. How long has the Confederation been providing escort services to human vessels? 2 weeks, Your Highness, since the humans rerouted. Their trade flows through Confederation space. Veltara turned away from the display, her mind racing. The Kepler Junction was the key hyperspace nexus for this entire sector. Controlling it meant controlling trade, communication, and military movement for dozens of star systems. 1,000 years that control had belonged to the Zephyrian Empire now. Human ships were bypassing Zephyrian space entirely, taking the longer route through Confederation territory. Other species were beginning to follow suit. The junction was still technically in Imperial space, but it was becoming increasingly irrelevant. Your Highness, her aide, Subminister Kextal, approached with obvious reluctance. There's been another development. What now? The Vorthon Syndicate has formally requested a meeting with Terran Federation representatives. They want to discuss mutual defense agreements. Veltara's skin flushed bright red. The Vorthon Syndicate controlled the antimatter production facilities that powered half the galaxy's faster-than-light drives. They had been Zephyrian allies for over 1,000 years. And the Terrans' response? They've agreed to meet. Next week, on Vorthon Prime. The observation deck fell silent except for the quiet hum of the ship's systems. Princess Veltara stared out at the colony ship, watching as it entered the hyperspace entry point and disappeared in a flash of twisted light. "Your Highness," Captain Mordith said carefully, "there are rumors. Throughout the fleet, throughout the bureaucracy, they say the humans are organizing." Organizing what? A new alliance. The Terran Federation, the Apex Confederation, the Crystalline Hegemony, the Voidwalkers, they're calling it the Cooperative Defense Initiative. Felt the deck seem to shift beneath her feet. The species the captain had named controlled, between them, roughly 40% of known space. If they formalized a military alliance, "That's impossible," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Those species have been neutral for millennia. The Apex Confederation hasn't formed a military alliance with anyone since the Darkness Wars." "Yes, Your Highness. But they've also never dealt with humans before." The words hung in the air like a blade. Veltara found herself remembering Ambassador Chen's face in those final moments in the negotiation chamber. The calm assessment in his eyes, the quiet dignity with which he had gathered his things and walked away, she had thought. She was dismissing an inferior species. Now she was beginning to wonder if she had simply revealed her own limitations. "Sub-Minister," she said finally, "prepare a communication to the Imperial Palace." "I want to speak with my father." "Yes, Your Highness. What message shall I send?" "Princess." Veltara was quiet for a long time, watching the empty space where the human colony ship had vanished. When she spoke, her voice was very small. "Tell him I think I may have made a mistake. The depths of space, light years away." Ambassador Marcus Chen sat in his office aboard a Terran Federation diplomatic station, reviewing the latest reports from across the galaxy. New alliances were forming. Old power structures were shifting. And at the center of it all, humanity was quietly building something unprecedented in galactic history. A coalition based not on fear or conquest, but on mutual respect and shared purpose. He smiled slightly and made a note in his personal log. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply walk away. Chapter 4. The revelation 6 months had passed since Ambassador Chen's departure from Zephyr Prime. The galaxy was changing in ways that defied all traditional models of interstellar politics. Emperor Zaxthel, ancient ruler of the Zephyrian Empire, stood in his private study deep within the Crystal Palace, reading reports that grew more disturbing with each passing day. His daughter Veltara sat across from him, her once vibrant skin now a subdued shade of gray that spoke of sleepless nights and growing anxiety. "Read it again," the Emperor commanded, his voice carrying the harmonic resonance of barely controlled anger. Veltara's hands trembled slightly as she activated the holographic display. "Trade volume through Imperial space has decreased by 6%. The Kepler Junction processed only 43 vessels this month, compared to 400 during the same period last year. The Vorthan Syndicate has officially withdrawn from the Imperial Defense Treaty. The Crystalline Hegemony has refused our request for antimatter fuel shipments." She paused, her voice growing smaller. "And the Terran Federation has been elected as the mediating authority for the new Galactic Commerce Commission." Emperor Zaxthel's sentient eyes blazed with fury. At nearly 2,000 years old, he had witnessed the rise and fall of dozens of civilizations. He had seen species evolve from primitive tool-users to masters of space-time manipulation. But he had never seen anything like what the humans were accomplishing. "How?" he demanded. "How does a species that achieved interstellar flight to centuries ago manage to outmaneuver an empire that has dominated this region for 10 millennia? Before Veltara could answer, Chief Minister Zelkuth entered the chamber. The old diplomat's usual composure was cracked, his skin cycling through colors that indicated extreme stress. "Your Imperial Majesty," he said, bowing deeply, "I bring news from the Apex Confederation." "Speak." "They've offered the humans a seat on the High Council of Ancient Civilizations." The silence that followed was absolute. The High Council was a body so exclusive that only 7 species in the entire galaxy had ever been invited to join. Membership required not just technological advancement or military power, but something far rarer, what the Confederation called civilizational wisdom. Emperor Zaxthel sat down heavily in his throne, suddenly looking every one of his 2,000 years. Species barely out of its homeworld's gravity well, invited to sit with beings older than our sun. What do they see that we have missed? Zelkoth hesitated, then activated his own holographic display. With your permission, Your Majesty, I'd like to show you something. Our intelligence services have been monitoring human diplomatic activities. Throughout the galaxy, the display showed a complex three-dimensional map of known space, with trade routes, alliance networks, and political relationships represented by flowing lines of different colors. 6 months ago, the map had shown the traditional power structures of few dominant empires controlling vast territories, with smaller species relegated to the margins. Now it looked entirely different. The human Zelkoth explained, have been doing something unprecedented. Instead of trying to conquer territory or dominate trade routes, they've been connecting things. He gestured, and the display zoomed in on a region that had previously been a political backwater. The Sigma Quadrant. 19 different species, none of them particularly powerful individually. 3 months ago, they were engaged in 17 separate territorial disputes into active wars. The display shifted, showing the same region as it existed today. Now they have a mutual defense compact, a unified trade currency, and a joint exploration initiative that's already discovered. 3 new habitable worlds. The mediator for all of these agreements, single human diplomat named Sarah Okafor. Princess Veltara leaned forward, studying the display. But how? We've tried to bring order to the Sigma Quadrant for centuries. The species there are too different, too stubborn, too proud, her father interrupted quietly. Too convinced of their own superiority? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Veltara's skin flushed with shame as she realized what he was implying. Zelkoth continued his briefing. Similar patterns are emerging throughout the galaxy. The humans aren't trying to build an empire. They're building something else entirely, a network. And they're doing it by treating every species, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, as an equal partner. He activated another display, this one showing communication traffic patterns. Look at this. Human diplomatic channels carry more interspecies communication than all other networks combined. They've become the galaxy's translators, mediators, and facilitators. Emperor Zaxthel studied the data with the calculating gaze of a being who had ruled for millennia. Show me their military capabilities. Complicated, Your Majesty. Zelkoth's expression grew thoughtful. By traditional measures, human military forces are relatively modest. But they're integrated into a defensive network that spans hundreds of star systems. Any attack on human territory would trigger responses from dozens of allied species, a mutual defense web, the Emperor mused, like the hive species, but voluntary. More than that, Zelkoth said. They've created something that doesn't exist anywhere else in the Galaxia military alliance. Based on genuine affection, the words struck Princess Veltara like a physical blow. She remembered Ambassador Chen's quiet dignity, his refusal to respond to her insults with anger or threats. Tad interpreted his silence as weakness. Now she was beginning to understand. It as something else entirely. Father, she said quietly. I need to tell you about that day, about what really happened during the negotiations. Emperor Zaxthal listened in growing silence as his daughter described her treatment of the human ambassador. When she finished, the chamber was quiet except for the distant chiming of the palace's ceremonial bells. You called him inferior, the Emperor said finally. Yes. You questioned his species' right to negotiate as equals. Yes. And he simply ... left. Veltara nodded, unable to trust her voice. Emperor Zaxthel was quiet for a long time, his ancient mind processing implications that stretched across centuries of potential consequences. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made both his daughter and his minister involuntarily step back. Wow. Do you understand what you've done? You weren't just insulting one diplomat or even one species. You were rejecting the fundamental principle that has allowed humans to achieve what we could not. What principle? That every thinking being has inherent dignity regardless of their physical form, their technological advancement, or the age of their civilization. The Emperor's voice grew soft, almost wondering. They've built the first truly egalitarian interstellar civilization in galactic history. And you, ... you spat on it. The silence that followed was broken by a soft chime from Zalkus's communication device. He glanced at it, and his skin shifted to a color none of them had seen before, a shimmering violet that indicated profound shock. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "receiving a transmission from Earth. From Ambassador Chen." Emperor Zaxtel straightened. "Put it through." The holographic display shifted, and suddenly Marcus Chen was standing in their chamber. Rather, his image was... He looked exactly as he had 6 months ago, calm, dignified, utterly unintimidated by the grandeur of imperial power surrounding him. "Your Imperial Majesty," he said, inclining his head in a gesture of respect that was neither subservient nor challenging. "Princess Veltara, Minister Zalkuth, I hope this message finds you well." He paused, and something that might have been humor flickered in his dark eyes. "I'm calling to extend an invitation." Epilogue. The Choice the Great Assembly Hall of the Galactic Commerce Commission was a marvel of cooperative engineering. Built in the neutral space between the Terran Federation and Apex Confederation territories, it incorporated architectural elements from over 50 different species. Crystalline spires from the hegemony reached toward organic curved walls contributed by the Vorthan Syndicate, while Voidwalker energy fields provided a spectacular display of lights that danced across the ceiling in patterns that somehow managed to be beautiful to every form of vision represented in the galaxy. Princess Veltara of the Zephyrian Empire stood at the threshold of the main assembly chamber. Her diplomatic escort arranged behind her in traditional formation. She wore the ceremonial robes of her house, but they felt different now, less like armor, more like costume. Inside the chamber, representatives from over 200 species moved in organized chaos, preparing for the first formal session of what historians were already calling the most significant diplomatic gathering in galactic history. The buzz of conversation, translation devices, and exotic forms of communication created a symphony of diversity that would have been impossible. Just 1 year ago, at the center of it all, calm as the eye of a storm, Ambassador Marcus Chen stood talking quietly with a group of delegates. He looked exactly as he had in the Crystal Palace, composed, alert, radiating the kind of natural authority that had nothing to do with titles or formal power. "Your Highness," Subminister Kextal said quietly beside her, "the Earth delegation is expecting us in Conference Room 7. The preliminary discussions are scheduled to begin in 20 minutes. Veltara nodded but didn't move. She was remembering another conversation 3 days ago with her father in his private study. "Why?" she had asked him. "Why are they giving us another chance? After what I did, after the damage I caused to our relationship, why would they invite us to participate in their new galactic order?" Emperor Zaxtel had been quiet for a long time before answering. "Because they're not building a galactic order, daughter. They're building something that has never existed before, a galactic community. And communities, by definition, have room for redemption." Now, standing at the threshold of that community, Princess Veltara felt the weight of choice pressing down on her. Behind her lay the familiar certainty of imperial superiority, the comfortable hierarchy that had defined Zephyrian civilization for millennia. Ahead lay something unprecedented and uncertain, a future where power came not from dominance but from cooperation, where respect was earned rather than demanded. "Your Highness?" Kextal prompted gently. Veltara took a deep breath and stepped forward into the chamber. Conversations didn't stop as she passed that would have been rude by the standards of most species represented here, but she was aware of glances, nods of acknowledgement, the subtle recognition of her presence. No bowing, no elaborate ceremonies of respect, just the simple courtesy extended to any legitimate participant in the proceedings. It was, she realized, exactly what she had failed to offer Ambassador Chen 6 months ago. The Earth delegation had claimed a modest section of the chamber, their portable furniture arranged in a simple circle rather than the hierarchical configurations favored by most galactic powers. As Veltara approached, Marcus Chen looked up from his conversation and smiled, not the diplomatic mask she had expected, but something warmer and more genuine. Princess Veltara, H.E. said, rising to greet her. "Welcome to the assembly. I'm glad you decided to accept our invitation." For a moment, she couldn't speak. The simple kindness in his voice, the complete absence of resentment or triumph, left her momentarily speechless. Finally, she found her words. "Ambassador Chen, I owe you an apology. My behavior during our previous meeting was inexcusable. I allowed my pride to blind me to the opportunity you were offering, and in doing so, I dishonored both our species." Marcus was quiet for a moment, studying her face with those calm, dark eyes that seemed to see everything. When he spoke, his voice was gentle. "Princess, I've learned that apologies have power only when they lead to different choices. The question isn't whether you made mistakes in the past, we all have. The question is what you choose to do going forward." He gestured to the chair beside him. "Would you like to sit in on our discussion? We're talking about establishing joint research initiatives for terraforming technology. I think your people's expertise in atmospheric manipulation could make a significant contribution." Veltara sat down, and for the first time in months, felt something she had almost forgotten: hope. Over the next 3 hours, she watched Marcus Chen work. She saw him mediate a dispute between two species who had been enemies for centuries, guiding them to a compromise that left both sides feeling heard and respected. She watched him facilitate a trade agreement between civilizations, separated by millions of light years and completely different economic systems. She observed him listen to a young delegate from a species so newly spacefaring. They still used chemical rockets, treating their concerns with the same attention he gave to representatives of ancient star-spanning empires, and slowly, she began to understand what her father had meant about civilizational wisdom. It wasn't about superior technology or military, or even political sophistication. It was about the radical idea that every conscious being had something valuable to contribute, and that the greatest strength came not from standing above others, but from helping them stand beside you. As the session concluded and delegates began filtering out toward their various receptions and private meetings, Marcus Chen turned to her one final time. "Princess, there's something I wanted to ask you. The Terran Federation is planning a cultural exchange program. Artists, scientists, philosophers sharing perspectives across species lines. We'd be honored if the Zephyrian Empire would consider participating." Veltara felt tears forming in her eyes, a biological response her people shared with humans, though for different evolutionary reasons. "After everything, you still want us as partners?" Marcus smiled, that quiet smile that had become his signature throughout diplomatic circles across the galaxy. "Princess, 6 months ago you taught me something important. You showed me that, even when negotiations fail, even when respect breaks down, even when people walk away from each other, there's always a chance to try again." He stood and extended his hand in the human gesture of greeting and partnership. "The question is, are you ready to walk forward together?" Princess Veltara looked at his outstretched hand, thinking of empires, in pride, of dignity and redemption, of the long, slow work of building bridges across the vast darkness between stars. Then she reached out and took his hand. "Yes," she said, "I'm ready." Outside the great assembly hall, the stars wheeled in their ancient courses, indifferent to the small dramas of consciousness and choice that played out in the space between them. But in that vast indifference, thinking beings had found something precious and fragile and worth protecting: the possibility that different forms of life could learn to understand each other, respect each other, and build something greater together than any of them could achieve alone. It was, perhaps, the most human idea ever conceived, and it was spreading throughout the galaxy. One conversation, one choice, one extended hand at a time. In his personal log that evening, Ambassador Marcus Chen wrote, "Today I learned that walking away isn't always the end of a conversation. Sometimes it's just the pause that gives everyone time to decide who they want to be when they meet again." The entry was later discovered by xenorchaeologists 3,000 years in the future, when they were studying the origins of what historians would call the Golden Age of Galactic Cooperation. By then, the simple words had become something of a founding principle for interstellar diplomacy. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is walk away. But the most important thing you can do is choose to walk back together.